Once you've ruled out the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be true.
And it is not a question of a little occultism or a touch of mysticism, Mr. Benton. It is vampires, the host of damned souls and telepaths.
I am thy father's spirit, doomed for a certain term to walk the night.
Here, the old gods aren't dead.
And what of the true god?
He's dead. Can't complain.
People assume that time is a strict progression of cause to effect, but actually, from a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint, it's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
You're listening to Paranormal UK Radio.
Hi everybody, this is Irene and Mark, the host of the Paranormal UK Radio Show, the flagship show of the Paranormal UK Radio Network. With me again tonight is my, I was going to say T-boy.
T-boy?
Mark Johnson.
Hello. Would you like a spot of tea?
It's just...
Would you like a spot of tea?
Cup of tea, yes, please.
I'd
love one right now, I tell you.
One lump or two? Because right now I feel like giving you a lot of lumps.
Sorry?
I could give you a lot of lumps.
Yeah, okay, then you'll get a clip around the ear for that one.
Uh-huh.
How are you going anyway?
Oh, just...
No, listen. No politics, no religion, and no talking about animals.
Okay, I'll just...
You can talk about animals. You can talk about animals.
I'll just sit here and twiddle my thumbs.
Okay then. So how's things going with you?
Same as last week.
Yeah?
Not much has changed over here, except, every time we think they start releasing restrictions, things spike and they turn right around and restrict us again.
Yeah. A couple of cities, or one city in particular over here, is being locked down again, and they're talking about maybe another 10, mostly around the London area. 10 areas being locked down. I don't know. It's the way I look at it. I'm stuck here in Wales. My children are in England. I haven't seen them since last year, and I don't even know if I'm going to see them this year because the borders are shut.
This is... I'm sorry. I know
Mind you, Mark.
What?
Mark, if I flew my son out to Spain and then back into Wales, he can visit me because people from Europe can fly in and they can visit people and they can have holidays. But I've got to fly him out and via a different route back into Wales, rather than him coming down the M4 like he normally would.
This is so stupid. And where I live in northern Jersey, and which is right next to New York, both New Jersey and New York have in place quarantines on visitors. So there are several states like Texas and Florida that are having really bad spikes of new cases. And so anybody who comes here from one of those states is automatically, if they're caught, they're placed into quarantine for 2 weeks.
Well, yeah.
Yep. And then now.
But
what?
But that's similar to here. You've got Scotland, Ireland, England and Wales, but the borders are shut. The borders, you can't go from one country to another.
Yeah.
If you do travel into one country, you're either turned back by the police or heavily fined or whatever. I don't know.
Well, that's okay. Now that did you see that they've got swine flu is now making a comeback out of China, of course.
Yeah. Well, so they say. Yeah. I did have the swine flu injection all those years ago, but I don't know whether it's still valid.
I don't know. It's just, 2020 is going down as the suckiest year on record in my lifetime.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's so many things happening. I think the world is coming to an end, as they say.
Well,
life as we know it has certainly come to an end.
Yeah. Well, I do want to know whatever happened to the murder hornets. That's right. You guys didn't get those out there. A couple months ago, they started talking about these big, giant hornets that that come from Asia that are very aggressive and can kill people. And they called them murder hornets, and the media was freaking out about it, and everyone was getting scared. And then all of a sudden, all the rioting started, and they just magically went away.
I didn't know that. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen anything on that at all.
Yeah, Google it. You'll see it. It's
murder hornets.
It's quite funny. Of course, everyone out here is saying that all this rioting and all these protesting and of course the viruses. Personally, I think it's all going to go away in November when we have our election.
Well, we'll wait and see. But murder hornets.
No,
I haven't heard it. Did anybody see any? Has anybody been murdered by one?
No. It was just the next media thing to scare the living crap out of everybody.
Oh, I tried that once.
What, to scare
Flying Hedgehog Man?
Oh.
Do you remember Flying Hedgehog Man?
No, I can't say
Lives
that I did.
at the bottom of my garden.
Flying Hedgehog Man. No.
Yes. Yeah.
I've seen your invisible Trey Moore, but not Flying Hedgehog Man.
No, it was when we were talking about, or somebody was going on about Mothman. I decided to bring out the Flying Hedgehog Man.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. People just didn't get the joke, though.
No. Well, that's what we should do sometime. We should have a cryptid palooza.
Paloozo.
Yeah.
Now, that's a long word.
It's like palooza means like a festival or celebration or something. We'll have a cryptid.
Have my Flying Hedgehog Man in it.
Yeah. Cryptid palooza.
There's nobody else to be able to produce any cryptos to come to it, will they? What?
Oh, God, kill me now.
Oh, go on then. Okay, let's get on with the show, shall we?
Yeah, let's do that because the world itself right now is just depressing the hell out of me.
It's going mad just like us.
Yep. So we'll apologize to our listeners and to our guests tonight that if we're a little punchy, just forgive us. It's just that these last several months are sending us over the deep end.
You over the deep end? I just gave up on life completely. Given up on humanity. Come on then. Let's get on.
Yeah. Don't get me started. So anyway, we want to welcome to the program tonight John Fraser, who's the author of a new book called Poltergeist, a new investigation into destructive hauntings. So John, welcome to the program.
Pleasure to be here. I can also talk a little bit about the Flying Hedgehog Man as well, if you want, though.
Oh, yeah. Well, he wears leggings. He's all prickly. He's got prickles all over him. It's like half a hedgehog, half a man,
Yeah.
Why he flies, I don't know. He's a bit of a Superman. And he lives down the bottom of my garden. I've seen him. Oh dear. A couple of martinis later, I did see him. Right, off we go.
Well, John, just to introduce you to our listeners, now your bio has you as a member of the Spontaneous Cases Committee and the Council of the Society for Psychic Research.
Psychical research, yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
It's American. It's American. He can't pronounce it, John.
Psychical research. Well, actually, I'm going off of what Amazon here.
I can't pronounce it either. I really can't.
Like I said,
SPR is far easier anyway.
Yes, it is, isn't it?
Now, you currently live in Croydon?
I do indeed, yes.
Oh, I'm from Croydon, South Croydon.
I'm North Croydon.
Oh, I was down by the bus garage. I had a house down by the bus garage, and before that, I had a house down by the Windsor Castle pub. Well, I didn't.
Yes, I think that shut several years ago, unfortunately.
No, it's now one of those. Oh Christ, what are they called? Like where you go in and you queue up and you take your food. What are they called?
Mini marts or something.
No, it is a pub. The Windsor Castle is a last house. Well, I haven't been up there for a while, but it is is the pub. The Red Deer, I think, shut.
That has definitely shut. Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
That is the Tesco. It's something to do with Tesco's now. Yeah. Tesco Extra.
Neither of them were haunted, at least, so that's something.
No. Anyway, that's nice. It's nice that you're in Croydon. West Croydon.
North Croydon, very, very, very close to the famous case of the Thornton Heath poltergeist, which I do mention in my book, Poltergeist, A New Investigation, and as an example of how even a rather suburban place like Croydon can actually have quite a few poltergeist incidents. Mm. The argument being that they're very, very common.
Yeah, I read about that. I can't really remember it, but I read about it years and years ago. It took place back in the Victorian times, if I'm right. Was it?
1930s.
Was it 1930s?
Yeah, it's even got Harry Price, a renowned ghost hunter, up there, along with Nandor Fodor, who wrote a whole book about it, and basically consisted of the usual things, flying cups, even a fender of a fireplace being thrown down the stairs, and somebody from the Croydon Advertiser nearly being crushed by a wardrobe. I mean, the reason I put that in the book wasn't just because it was local, it's because poltergeists are thought to be quite rare, and I thought it's a good example just to show that literally 300 yards from where I lived, there was not only a case, but a rather famous case. And I think once I started investigating the subject, I found they actually became a very common phenomenon indeed.
Yeah. Well, that one was quite an interesting one, if I remember rightly, and I can't remember the road that it was in, but I know it was down near the Mayday Hospital down that way.
I do remember it, but as a matter of policy, I don't say it, because somebody has a semi-detached house just round the corner from me that could suddenly have people knocking on the doors that probably knows nothing about the case. Yeah. So it's probably best not to mention it. What it's also probably famous for is clumsy investigation techniques, which is a good reason to take care when you do investigate poltergeists. I mean, Nandor Fodor had the particular lady which the phenomena surrounded strip searched and inspected up at his headquarters in central London. He did suspect her of fraud, possibly unfairly, but nevertheless, these are not good tactics to use when investigating anything, especially something as scary to a family as a poltergeist.
No, that's true. Very true.
Now,
right.
let me ask you some questions that, some of our listeners might ask in relation to a poltergeist. What is the difference between a poltergeist and a regular haunting? Because and the reason I'll ask this based off of my own learning over the years, when I first heard the term poltergeist, and this is way back before the 82 Spielberg movie, it was always, poltergeist, German, meaning noisy ghost. And yet the theories back then was a lot of poltergeist activity was actually not related to ghosts or spirits, but was the energy of teenagers, especially girls, going through puberty, like spiking out and moving things. That definition seems to have kind of gone by the wayside now, and it's taken on more of a paranormal, spiritual aspect. So I'd like to know what your thoughts are on that.
Now, first of all, people seem to think that if a teenage girl has psychic energy that makes things move, I mean, I would consider that pretty paranormal in any case. Maybe not paranormal in the afterlife sense, but certainly paranormal. But the question was, what is the difference between ghosts and poltergeists? I actually argue in my book that there probably isn't much of a difference at all. Now, one of the reasons we probably haven't had much debate about what poltergeists are is when I first started researching this, I actually found, with one possible exception in the 1990s, there probably hasn't been a major book on poltergeists since Colin Wilson wrote one in, I think, about 1982, 83. So there's not really been a sort of mantle to actually progress any argument. But going back to ghosts and poltergeists, I'll give you an example. My colleagues, or former colleagues in the SPR, Alan Gold and Tony Cornell, wrote a book in the 1970s called Poltergeist. It seems to be a very common name for books on poltergeists, but there you go. Now, they actually studied 500 cases and found that about 30% of them, poltergeist cases, had audio ghostly phenomena, and about another 30% had visual ghostly phenomena. So there's one heck of an overlap to begin with. And then when you actually look at a lot of hauntings, they're actually based on flimsy historic evidence, such and such a castle is supposed to be haunted by a headless lady, and so on. So when you take them out of the equation, I would actually make a claim, and it's possibly a controversial one, that when you look at most hauntings, there's quite often some kind of poltergeist element, or active hauntings at least. And when you look at most poltergeist cases, there's usually some audio or visual phenomena that we'd more kind of call ghosts. So I'd actually challenge whether there is actually a difference.
Now, what made you focus on writing more specifically about poltergeists rather than just regular haunted locations? What intrigues you about poltergeist cases?
What intrigues me about poltergeist cases is, now, if we go and investigate what you'd call a regular haunted phenomena, we're talking about audio and visual phenomena. If you're successful, you might view something through the corner of your eye at 2 a.m. when tired, possibly a shadowy figure, possibly for about 5 seconds. You might, if you're lucky, get some kind of unfocused image on your camera. None of these things, I don't think, whether or not they are paranormal, have the ability to actually prove the paranormal. Psychologists will talk about all kinds of things that can make you see things through the corner of your eye, expectations of being in a haunted environment and so on. But when it comes to poltergeist phenomena, if a cup suddenly moves across a table, if a stone suddenly falls from the sky, if water appears from nowhere, if a mark suddenly appears as a scratch in your arm, now you've got what I'd call the fact or fraud scenario. Either it's fact in some kind of paranormal sense, or somebody's making it up or faking it or tricking you. That's a heck of a lot easier to prove. And I think if we're actually going to prove the paranormal in a big sense rather than just convince ourselves of it, it's poltergeist phenomena that's going to do it.
You know, I've I've been a paranormal investigator for almost 20 years, and there have been a couple of cases where we've had some poltergeist type activity. In fact, one of the first cases I worked on when I formed my own group back in 2004, there was a house that was having a lot of different activity. We got a lot of audio and visual, evidence. But one of the things the client would talk about was how there would be these puddles of water that would appear in the middle of the floor out of nowhere, and they'd have no idea where it would come from. And that was one of the only cases I ever dealt with which had water appear. And so I'm interested because you mentioned it as part of your poltergeist phenomenon that you've investigated.
Yes, I mean it's probably not the most common symptom, but it's certainly cropped up in the famous case in Pontefract, England, the Black Monk of Pontefract case, which was probably not a black monk and took place in an average council house, and which I make good mention of in my book. I'd probably say it affects about 10 to 15% of poltergeist cases. And I think my colleague Guy Playfair of the SPR, to keep it simple, who investigated the Enfield poltergeist, thought it more of being a symptom of whatever energy might have been used, a sort of waste product, than a phenomena itself. But nevertheless, if you've got water appearing where there wasn't water and no grounds for condensation, you've got a real mystery on your hands. And if there's no way it can be explained naturally, you've got a prima facie paranormal event. So it's interesting. Are you saying you hadn't actually heard of that in the poltergeist context, but had just experienced it in a haunting you were investigating?
Right. I had never previously encountered it before.
Okay, well, that not only shows that it seems to be a common factor, but it also shows what I was saying earlier, that there is a heck of an overlap between ghost and poltergeist phenomena. Now, a lot of people might disagree with me, but the more you look into it, the more they seem to be, in many ways, inseparable. Now, what they are, we can debate, but I think the first thing one has to look at is this strange definition we've got. I think the Germans had it about right. A poltergeist is a noisy ghost, and a apparition is a ghost that hasn't made any noise yet.
That's a good way of looking at it.
I think. This house that I live in, John, it's no secret that it's haunted. And I, at times, now, it comes in spurts. Every now and then it'll come in spurts, and then it'll go away for a couple of years, and then something else will happen. But when I first moved in, I was getting like small stones thrown at me in the hallway.
That's poltergeist, isn't it? Rather than haunting.
There was a load of us chatting in the kitchen, as you do. You always congregate in the kitchen, don't you? So we had friends around, and we were talking in the kitchen, and all of a sudden, this stone came out of the ceiling and went down behind me, slipped down the radiator, because I was leaning against the radiator. So it slipped down the radiator and hit the floor. It just came out of nowhere, and everybody saw it.
And in your, if you don't mind me asking, in your haunted house, do you also see apparitions?
Oh yeah,
absolutely. So,
it's not. It doesn't worry me. It's not uncommon to walk into a room and suddenly you see something there, and then it just kind of wafts away, sort of thing. But we get footsteps, we get bangs. Now, there was a time when my daughter-in-law came to stay, and I sent her up the shop to get some shopping. She came back with a load of shrapnel, I call it shrapnel, coins, a load of coins. She said, here's your change. I said, I'll throw it on top of the fridge. So she just threw it on top of the fridge, and it just went everywhere. We went to bed that night. Following morning, we both came down the stairs together, went into the kitchen, and the money, I'm not kidding you, and we tried to do it ourselves, but you cannot get it right. There was so much of this money. The largest coins were at the bottom, heads turned up. The next size coin was placed dead center in the larger coin, heads turned up, and it went like that, like a little tower. Mm-hmm. It stood up like a little tower, and it was perfectly placed. And when we knocked it down, and of course we tried to do it ourselves. You need a very steady hand, and you still cannot get it exactly right, especially with the very tiny coins at the top. It was amazing. Another time, I had friends come to stay. She brought a load of books with her because she was staying for some time. And the books she put on the windowsill in the bedroom. We got these deep windowsills, and came downstairs. We had a couple of drinks in the garden. Went back. When she went back upstairs, she shouted and screamed at me. I came running up, and all the books were piled in a pyramid, and they were balanced. One little touch with a feather, and they could have fallen down, but they didn't fall down.
Just going back to you mentioned the stones dropping from the ceiling.
Well, we were in the kitchen, and that's where it came down out of the kitchen.
Yeah. Now, one of the claims I make in the book, Poltergeist: A New Investigation, is that poltergeists are actually a worldwide phenomena, but we possibly don't realise it because we kind of call them different things around the world. Now, one of my colleagues, Alan Murdy, has been doing quite a lot of research into the paranormal in Colombia, thankfully, because he came up with a very good example. There's entities in Colombia that are known as duende, which is basically Colombian for goblins. Now, Spanish Colombian doesn't. Oh,
I got one of them under my stairs.
Spanish Colombian doesn't actually have a word for poltergeist.
Yeah.
But funnily enough, these duende, who we probably wouldn't take seriously because, we can go ghost hunting, but not many of us want to go goblin hunting. Actually, when you look at the stories, throw stones, make a lot of noises, chuck things around, maybe occasionally start fires, and do all the things the American or the British poltergeist would do.
And in their eyes, it's like a goblin?
No, not really. It's just the word that they use. It's not, believe it or not, if you go to Romania, a lot of poltergeist incidents are described as vampire incidents, simply because that's the terminology of something that's weird and occult and scary for that matter. We don't have a tradition of vampires, so we call them poltergeists because it seemed to be a nice word for the European Americans. But if you actually go around the world, you've got the same phenomena happening in various different places, just called different things. And once you kind of start investigating them, you start to realise just how common the whole thing is.
I've got a name for it as well. I call it Little Bugger. Because one thing that disappears a lot, well, two things that disappear a lot in this house is your eyeglasses, right? Mm-hmm. About 16 pairs this thing's had.
Do they come back?
No, these don't.
Oh,
Cigarette lighters. Where he's stashing them, I do not know. I've hunted everywhere, but they keep disappearing. Over 13 years, I've lost quite a few cigarette lighters and pairs of glasses. Other times, things disappear and they come back, but not in the same position that you left them. For instance, I was in the bathroom one day, putting my... For everybody that likes a bit of English slang, putting a slap on the face. In other words, putting my makeup on. And I took the lid off of the foundation, and I stood at the mirror putting the foundation on. The lid was beside me on the sink. Okay? When I went to get the lid to put back on the foundation, it was gone. I came downstairs after hunting for it for quite a while and giving up. I came downstairs. I went into a little later on, I went into the toilet downstairs, and it was on the sink in the toilet downstairs.
Wow.
Just the lid. Just the lid. Things like that.
Can I ask Mark a question, just out of curiosity? Have you ever had an incident like that where, I mean, nothing to do with a haunting, where you've had a item and it's disappeared and then either turned up in the same place or turned up in a different place, and you've kind of scratched your head and wondered what happened and then just thought it's one of those things?
Well, I haven't had anything disappear and then turn up in other places. I do currently have, and I have no idea what's going on unless I'm just going crazy and throwing things out by accident that I shouldn't. But for some reason, of all my measuring cups in the kitchen, I'm missing my 3/4 measuring cup. I don't know where it went. I had 3 of them, and they're all gone. And then I had a lid for a glass Pyrex-like container, and I remember the lid. It was in the dishwasher and whatever, and now that's gone. And my wife thinks I just may have thrown them away accidentally without thinking about it. I'm going, I know I didn't do that. So it's like suddenly lately I just have things disappearing, and I have no explanation for it.
And you kind of scratch your head and you say it's just one of those things, as everybody does. The reason I was asking that question, because it was interesting that Irene mentioned it as well, in context of a possible poltergeist case or haunting or the same thing in her house. But there was a colleague of mine called Mary Rose Barrington who sadly passed on a few months ago. And she actually spent a lot of time, which she would call kind of categorizing, studying what she would call JOTS, which is literally an abbreviation of just one of those things. When things kind of disappear and turn up somewhere else, that would be a throwaway JOT. Or when it turned up in the same place, it would be a comeback JOT. Or in your case, with your dishwasher item, when it disappeared forever, it would actually be termed a runaway JOT.
A runaway JOT.
No, where it gets interesting is, just like you were saying, Irene, this is something that does sometimes happen in a haunted poltergeist type of environment. However, if it happens in that sort of environment, is it not also possible that when you have these one-off incidents, they're just low-level poltergeist activity, sort of tiny little spurts of energy, which we don't even identify as such?
Well, it could be.
If that was the case, we'd not only have poltergeists as being worldwide, we'd not only have them appearing in most hauntings, if not all. We would actually have lots of poltergeist cases which are never recorded because nobody feels it's worth reporting, because it's just one of those things that happens in everyday life.
Or otherwise people just put it down to something else. Like in America, everybody's got a demon. We have ghosts over here. They like to have demons over there. And they get scratched and things happen. Same sort of phenomena as poltergeist activity. A lot of it.
Just terminology, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we call them, I'm always very wary about using the word demonologist or demon, simply because I think if poltergeists are either based on or use emotional energy of somebody, there's nothing quite like heightening somebody's emotional energy than saying there might be a demon in your house. It's a good way of scaring somebody.
Yeah, but you see, I don't see demon's just a word. You've got to give a word to name something. It's just a word. To me, a demon is not what you see on the television with these big grotesque things coming at you from hell and all this sort of thing, or what the Bible teaches you. The church teaches you, sorry. It's more, to me, energy. It's just energy.
I'm sure I'm sure you're right, but to the average person, if somebody is visited by a demonologist and says, hey, there's a portal that has, demonic power coming through it, or whatever terminology they'd use, I would actually say it can probably make things worse, because if these things are created by emotional energy, there's nothing going to heighten the emotions like being told you've got a demon in your place. It can be nearly self-perpetuating. John,
it could be created by emotional energy. Let's face it. Tulpas exactly. Now, aren't they? To me, they're a similar thing. And that's created by the mind. It's created by a person maybe that... We worked, didn't we, Mark? We worked a poltergeist, a tulpa case.
Yes, we did. And that definitely was the client she was manifesting things without her own knowledge.
Yeah, she was a very troubled girl, and she'd been to see so many of these psychics and mediums, and one of them had told her that her house had been used by a witch coven, and they practiced in her basement. She didn't click on at that point that she didn't have a basement, and there was never a basement in that house. But she was so taken with it that she was seeing the old hags and witches everywhere she went. Mm-hmm. She'd look in the mirror and suddenly one appear in the mirror and things like this. And we realised in the end that what she was creating, and the phenomenon of it all and one thing or another led us to believe in the end that what she was actually creating it herself, projecting this thing into the house. This energy that created this problem that was causing all the trouble.
And we tend to call them tulpas in some instances. But what is the difference between a tulpa and you guys are aware of the Philip experiment, which I mentioned in my book, which took place in the late 1970s in Canada? In which a group of Canadian parapsychologists decided to create an imaginary ghost. In effect, build your own ghost, not to be recommended to viewers at home. But seriously, what they actually did was they invented a character called Philip, who was a cavalier from the 17th century in the UK. They gave him a wife that committed suicide. They drew pictures of him, picture of his wife. They chucked in a lover for good luck. That's probably why the wife committed suicide. Philip was apparently to have died a broken man. And they talked about him, and they kind of built him up a personality. And then suddenly things started moving, and the table started tipping. And there's actually a rather good recording on Canadian TV when they actually brought Philip, who of course doesn't exist, isn't any afterlife. They brought Philip into the studio, and he apparently, I think he threw a table a good few feet across the room. Mm-hmm. Now, it strikes me that now this is going to be controversial, and 2/3 of the paranormal community would disagree with me. Do you actually need the afterlife to explain most poltergeist incidents, or even apparitional incidents, if indeed they are one and the same? And B, haven't you kind of in the Philip experiment got virtually the same sort of thing as you'd have in Eastern countries, except, as you said earlier, you'd call them tulpas?
Yeah.
Same phenomena all around the world, different names. I mean, I kind of think, I've actually had a quick cup of coffee before I came on air, and I've got it in a mug that's full of, especially a penguin mug, got all the breeds of penguins. And sometimes I think we kind of separate the paranormal into too many different categories. I mean, ultimately, all these penguins are penguins, and ultimately, I think if we're investigating the paranormal, we should probably be looking for one undiagnosed power rather than all these categorizations, be they witchcraft or psychic energy or ghosts or poltergeists. I suspect they're all a lot more similar than we think. And that primarily is what my book tries to argue.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Barry Taff, from America, he wrote a book, UFOs Above, Ghosts Below. He linked the two.
When did you write that, by the way? When did you write that?
No, I never wrote it.
When did Barry? What year? Give it.
He wrote that book. Oh God, it was several years ago. But he also was of the opinion, which I totally disagreed with him on.
Parapsychologist.
Yeah, he was one of the famous parapsychologists that worked with Dr. Eileen Moss out of UCLA and worked on the cases that they turned the movies into, like the Entity case. There was also the one San Pedro case, which they made some documentaries on, where the one investigator got hung in the attic. With a lot of poltergeist phenomenon. But he also strongly felt, and he was arguing in his books, that most of this type of phenomenon was a type of poltergeist phenomenon being caused by the person there, and they all had a tendency, or they all had some form of epilepsy.
Yeah, well, I disagree there, because there is no way that anyone in this house is bringing in this poltergeist activity into this house.
Yeah, well, Barry Taff is also kind of an ass, too, so...
Yeah. Sorry?
He's kind of an ass, so, arguing with him, he's very opinionated, and he thinks he's right, and it's like, okay, well, whatever. He goes, well, that's what all the evidence suggests. It's like, no.
Epilepsy. I mean, I'm trying to think of three famous poltergeist cases, and trying to find where there might be any evidence of epilepsy. I'm sure there's one or two, but it strikes me as being far too simplistic to say it's one particular thing. I mean, I doubt you could even pin it all on adolescent child. I mean, I think if it is an energy, we're probably talking about an energy that can be created by one or more traumatic triggers. I mean, epilepsy could be one. Adolescence, we all know how traumatic that can be. Although some of us have to look back a little bit further than others. No, and I mean, you've got things like house moves. You go into a new house, and you think it's haunted, but could it not be the trauma of a house move, which is more stressful than people actually imagine, that actually triggers off the haunting or poltergeist activity itself?
Yeah.
You've got a whole sphere of things. Obviously, a death in the family is one of those stressful events, and immediately things start happening or moving, you kind of think it's an afterlife communication. And I'm not discounting that in the slightest, and it's a perfectly valid theory. But is it not also possible that it could actually be the emotional trauma itself that's triggering off some kind of inner energy?
Well, that's what I was going to say, yeah, the emotional trauma. It could well be. But then again, where does that place my house? Because there's no emotional trauma in this house. All I've got is 3 ghosts. But it's a happy house, happy family. None of us have got any psychological problems or anything like that. Maybe me a little bit when you think about I do paranormal stuff, like talk on the radio, but that's about it.
You're not near a river, are you, by any chance?
There's a stream. The house is called Glenant, which in Welsh means a house by the stream.
Funny that, wasn't it? I'm not psychic actually, but there is a chap which I do mention in the book, Poltergeist, A New Investigation, called W.J. Lambert, who I'm starting to sound like a walking advertisement for the SPR, who in the 1950s did a very detailed study for the SPR and found that about 80% of poltergeists from memory were very close to a source of water, and about 2/3 of them started off in the wet winter season as opposed to the dry summer season. So if one had to try to work out what triggered off a poltergeist, it would be certain emotional factors sort of combined with a catalyst of certain environmental factors, of which water certainly appears to be a key one. Now we haven't got any obvious emotional triggers talking about your house. Obviously, if somebody was investigating it, we'd have to look more into the background, but just for...
The only emotional trigger that was ever in this house, as far as I know, was that the wife, Annie, the man that built the house, he lost his wife to tuberculosis in the Edwardian times.
That's
leaving a daughter 8 years old without a mother. That is the only emotional thing that ever happened, I think, in this house.
No, there isn't. I mean, you're right. I'm just looking at it from what we know. There isn't any of those emotional triggers, but it is quite interesting that straight out the blue, I asked you, is it close to a stream? And it's actually called after a stream, because that does give one possible trigger that certainly in investigating poltergeist cases has found to be incredibly common.
Yeah. Well, when I used to do investigations, that was one of the questions I asked when someone turned around and said, I've got a ghost, I've got a haunting. I used to ask if there was a river nearby or water nearby.
It should be the compulsory number one question, I agree. Along with, there's also a very famous case of both apparitions and poltergeist activity of Langenhoe Church in Essex, which was investigated by one of my former colleagues in the Ghost Club, not the SPR. Peter, I thought I'd get the
Underwood.
Underwood, yes, yeah, you know the case well. Now, apart from other things, of course, Langenhoe is, I think, virtually on the epicenter of the last major earthquake near Colchester in the United Kingdom in the late 19th century, and there's certainly got a lot of geological activity. So you kind of look at possible environmental factors and possible emotional factors, and in nearly all cases there seems to be one or the other, or possibly both.
I used to have a girl that worked for me in my organisation, and she lived... Where is it? Tornado Alley now, Mark?
That's the middle of the country here, anywhere from Texas, Nebraska, Kansas, all the way up through Arkansas, Missouri. So it's the middle.
Well, she lived. I can't remember whereabouts she lived, but she lived along that Tornado Alley, and she always used to know when there was going to be some earth tremors, a tornado coming through, anything like that, because she used to get paranormal activity 1 or 2 days before. That's really strange stuff would happen, and then she put it all together that every time she got paranormal activity, within no time there was some sort of geological event took place in the area.
Are you still in contact with that lady, or?
No, I'm not, I'm afraid.
That's a shame. I'd love to. If I ever do a chapter 11 of my book, it's 10 chapters, by the way. I mean, that's just fascinating, because just straight out the blue, I mean, all these things anyone that writes a book in the paranormal is postulating a hypothesis. It can never be any better than that. Anyone that says I found proof of what the paranormal is probably far too carried away with.
I don't think we'll find proof in our time.
May well not. It's may well be for even younger generations than us. But it's actually fascinating that when I tell a story like that, you suddenly come back and talk about this lady who has paranormal events just before an earthquake, because that's just the sort of thing that some of the cases I looked into were hinting at. But that is probably even more dramatic, to be honest.
She came in very handy. She came in very handy. Yeah, she was a very, very talented woman, very intelligent. She had her family and everything, but she was a normal housewife, but highly intelligent. And she put it all together in the end. That every time she got this paranormal activity, and she would tell me what she actually saw, what happened that night or what happened that day in the way of something paranormal. And then she'd turn around and say, I'll give it 2 days. And she said, something's going to happen. It's, and she was never wrong. She was never wrong.
I wish you were still in contact. I'd love to swap a couple of emails with her, but still, no worries. If she's listening,
well, she may be.
But
if she does contact me, obviously I'll put her your way.
Tell her to send me an email or something, because I'd just love to. I mean, it's one thing talking about these things, but it's lovely to have some kind of record of exactly what happened and where and when, because it's I kind of call myself more a paranormal researcher these days. I've done a good fair share of spending the night in haunted houses, but in some ways I far rather spend a little bit of time in dusty libraries trying to research things as well, and talking to witnesses and things like that, because I think it's only by talking to more people and getting other people's experiences that you can really get to the truth of these things.
Well, with this lady also, like I said, she came in very, very handy, because if I had a case come in that was in America or somewhere in America, she would look into everything, what the land was built on, especially geological stress, the water table and one thing or another. And she'd come back and she'd say, well, yesterday or something, they had a 2.2 earthquake, tremors, because she used to follow all that on the geological maps and one thing or another. But whenever she had the paranormal activity herself, then something major would usually happen.
One of my, it was interesting, I think one of you were speaking about the that tough guy and connecting UFOs with.
I haven't read his book. I just know he.
I read it years ago. No, he was equating poltergeist-like activity to people with epilepsy.
Yeah. Well, one of my pre-readers of the book, it's actually out in August, but obviously there's been a few review copies running around. A chap called Hugh Pincott, who helped set up another organisation called ASAP. He actually reminded me that probably a far more sympathetic character, Hilary Evans, actually made the very same connection between UFOs and other phenomena. He only actually reminded me of this about a week ago, and it's something I'm going to actually look into, because one thing my book doesn't mention is UFOs, but I'm starting to wonder how wide you could actually push this potential theory. Now, I suspect most ufologists these days don't take the literal little green men from outer space. Some do, but over and above Close Encounters of the Third Kind, if we're talking about lights and in the sky and things like that, they do seem to have a similarity to, if you like, apparitional phenomena. But I'm not an expert in UFOs. It's just a direction that might be interesting to take it in the future.
Yeah, but many of the cases that I worked on, where people were having hauntings of one thing or another, one of the questions that I did say at some point after what I would do was investigate the ghosty side first. And then I would turn around and say, have you ever seen anything like UFOs or anything like that? Oh, yeah, we had it, and that made me think maybe there is something tied in here somewhere. They're seeing ghosts, they're having hauntings, they're having paranormal problems, and yet they've also had UFO experiences.
Well, either the little green men are only interested in making contact with the psychically gifted people, which is possible, but it's also equally possible that the experience of a UFO has something to do with all the other bits of the paranormal.
Yeah.
I think one seems simpler than the other, to be honest, and I think the little green men seeking out psychically gifted people is complex.
Yeah.
Not impossible, but complex. I'd prefer to go for the one that puts everything in one box rather than having lots of little different boxes of paranormal, each organisation investigating their own little bit and
where the connection is
never coming together on it.
And you see, for me, I come from where my beliefs have changed through the years, through all this investigation, where I feel all of these different types of paranormal events, from ghosts and hauntings, poltergeist activities, to even UFO encounters, to time slips, to everything is interconnected. And it's all aspects of reality that we just don't fully understand because we're just so focused on the three-dimensional physical reality with a linear time stream. That's how we're trained to think. And in reality, there's so much more going on around us. There really isn't... there is no such thing as paranormal. It's all normal. It's all part of our reality. We just are not used to it, or we've been told it doesn't exist. And, now those of us who experience it realize that, yes, it does exist. There are things that are all around us, and we don't necessarily perceive them with our six senses. I mean, we use a lot of equipment nowadays to try to capture or learn about some equipment. I mean, some phenomenon. But, 100 years ago, nobody knew what radiation was. That was not anything that we had any idea about. And now we definitely know, not only we know about radiation, we know different types of radiation, and we can measure it. But we couldn't back then. And I feel the same goes with a lot of paranormal phenomenon. Is just that we're in the 21st century and we may think we're very advanced, but we're really not. We have a long way to go, and we just haven't found the right tools, or we haven't grown and advanced enough to be able to fully find ways to measure this phenomenon and better understand it.
I would think there's every possibility that you might be onto something there. I mean, the paranormal. It's funny these days with viruses. They're always talking about a new normal, but I suspect a new normal happens every time science advances. I mean, to be honest, some scientific theories, I'm not quite sure we're ready for negative universes. I mean, I'm not even sure what that means, to be honest. I can far easier get my head around a good old-fashioned poltergeist with a bit of energy that throws things around, and I kind of going through a negative universe and finding everything mathematically backwards, or whatever that means. I'm not a physicist, but for me, straightforward common sense viewpoint, that seems to be paranormal certainly based on our normal experience of the world.
Well, we've also talked several times on the show that, again, with Irene and I and all the research that we've done over the years, where we feel some paranormal activity, seeing a ghost, for an example, is actually not seeing a spirit, but has something to do with these other realities that we're talking about, or the fact that time, our concept of time, is not correct, because we look at time as being linear, where these advanced physicists in dealing with theories like string theory not only talk about all time happening at once, but that there are multiple dimensions and multiple universes out there that overlap. And so that's where it might get complicated for you in that, we talk about all the time that if you see an apparition of somebody in period clothing walking down the stairs, did you just see a ghost, the spirit of someone who died? Or did you happen to see a living, breathing human being who looks kind of hazy or see-through because you're seeing them in a different time?
Or like the film The Others, which I think is an excellent little film with Nicole Kidman. Are they both seeing each other and thinking the other one's a ghost?
Well, I can verify that one.
Go on.
I can verify that one. We've spoken about this several times on the show, where my son was living in an old mansion in Surrey, and he was living in one room because he was doing the mansion up for his boss. So he was living in one room. There was a beautiful staircase in there and everything, absolutely lovely. We went to visit him there, and he said, "Come on, Mum, I'll take you around the house." So me and my husband and my son started walking around the house, one room to another, seeing what he'd done and how the work was progressing. We eventually got up into the attic, which would have been the servants' quarters. And we were looking around this dark, old, empty attic, nothing in it except this kind of wooden box which was on the floor, fixed to the floor like a blanket box, and which I found quite fascinating. I would like to have got it up off the floor and taken it home. But as we left, my son and my husband walked out of the door of this particular room in the attic, because it was made up of several rooms, this attic, walked out to the door, and they were on the outside of the door. I was just about to go through the door, and suddenly I saw a woman in period clothing, dressed like a maid. She was as shocked to see me as I was her. You could see it on her face. She saw me. She literally did see me, and I told you that, didn't I, Mark?
Oh, yeah. Yes, you said how she reacted to you.
She reacted. She showed reaction. It only happened for a short period of time, because then my husband said, "Are you coming?" And that was the end of it. But it was, you know how if you see something and you're suddenly shocked, you're kind of gobsmacked and your mouth drops open? It was that type of thing. And you could see it in her eyes. She was looking directly at me, and I was looking directly at her.
Yeah. I mean,
I definitely believe that. I know that happens. I know it. I've experienced it.
That's definitely evidential. I mean, one of the reasons, I mean, again, probably about 2/3 of people interested in the paranormal would disagree with me, but one of the reasons I don't necessarily favor a conventional afterlife theory, at least, is which that obviously isn't.
No, that wasn't. No, it's a time slip.
Because in most paranormal poltergeist cases, which, as I said, I'm actually making a claim that poltergeists and ghosts have a huge overlap anyway. But in most poltergeist ghost cases, they don't actually, and especially poltergeist ones, they don't actually do much of any real communicative intelligence. Like, for example, the Andover case, which was, wait for it, investigated by Barry Colvin of Society of Psychical Research.
SPR to us.
SPR, actually. Basically, the poltergeist did communicate in raps.
Did it?
And yes, but did it tell the people who it was, or did it have a message for somebody? No, it told next week's football results
in raps.
And it got them wrong most of the time. So, I mean, if I had died and wanted to do something else, I think I'd want to get past the stage of Leeds United 2, Burnley 0. And that's no disparagement to Burnley supporters. But, it's in the Black Monk of Pontefract case, which Colin Wilson had great mention of in his book in Poltergeists 30 years ago, and which I kind of revisit as well. There was tremendous phenomena, including a grandfather clock falling down the stairs, possible poltergeist scratchings, and in all that time, there wasn't any significant communication. It was just like a bundle of basic energy doing random things. I mean, it's a long story why it became the Black Monk. It started off being called Mr. Nobody, then got the nickname Fred, and then somebody did a bit of not very well-researched history and thought there might have been a monastery not too far from there, but there's plenty of monasteries in Pontefract, but certainly none near that particular site. And there's absolutely no reason to think there should be.
Also, there's also another way with the monasteries. They were wearing different coloured robes depending on which monastery it was, wasn't it? Whether they were.
That's right. I think with
Franciscan or whatever.
I think they had. Well, the thing is about Pontefract is it had a Clunic priory and a Franciscan priory. So it actually had, I think it had the option of both black and brown. And I think somebody very briefly saw a gentleman in a dark robe. It didn't identify it as a monk, but then people cottoned on a few years later. But I'm kind of thinking, just in the same way as you'd kind of want to give your name to weird stuff happening as a vampire in Romania, Pontefract has two monasteries. It's only a town of 25,000 people. It also has a hermitage, which is kind of underground cells where monks used to stay. So it's kind of got ecclesiastical centre printed all over it. So I think that was just the best way Pontefract residents had of expressing what it might be. At the end of the day, it didn't do anything to indicate it was a monk. It didn't ask for mass or prayers or anything like that. It just spent 9 months throwing things about, making dents in the furniture, and basically, not doing anything very sensible at all.
But then again, right? What they were seeing was things being thrown about. They didn't actually see a monk throwing it about, did they?
No, at the very end, they saw a shadowy figure that may have been in a long robe. That was about as close as he got to a monk. Funnily enough,
anything.
Funnily enough, the only thing that was actually near that house is an old leprosy hospital. And I actually went down into the museum archives, and so if anything, that was, if one has to try to find an afterlife identity, it's far more likely to be, a poor inpatient in his nightgown and a
trauma again.
Monk in a robe, yeah. But my suspicion is it was neither of them, because, whether you're an evil monk who murdered a child, so the story goes, or a poor old leper, you'd surely want to do something rather than just throw things around and not do anything in particular in 9 months.
Well, apparently he did pull the daughter up the stairs, didn't he? Yeah. And then he also pulled Carl Beatty up the stairs as well.
No, I mean, I was including the daughter in throwing things. Yeah, I mean, around, but I mean, you're not exactly got an intelligent entity trying to make intelligent conversation or pass on a message or do anything you or me or anyone would want to do if we could envisage ourselves kind of passed on and wanting to contact our loved ones. It doesn't behave like a sort of intelligent, rational human being in any way, shape or form. So I kind of think it might not be an intelligent, rational human being. It might be that hidden bit of our psyche which probably did behave like a spoilt 2-year-old child letting off energy tantrums when everything gets the better of us.
Yeah.
But I could be wrong.
Yeah, mine. But
did really pull Carol Beatty up the stairs? I missed that one.
Oh, don't take any notice about it because they saw the rope tied round his waist.
Oh, okay.
But he went up the stairs like a rocket. You know what most haunteds like. Yeah. But you're talking about rapping and one thing and another. Well, majority of this started with the Fox sisters, didn't it? Out in America, and their way of communicating was through rapping. You know, same way as on Most Haunted. You know, knock once if you're there and twice if you're not, sort of thing. But which one of the sisters? When was it? Back in 1888, Margaret. She said that it was all fake. You know, it was all a hoax. But that started the spiritual movement in America, the Fox sisters. Yeah. But my grandfather, he used to after my grandmother died, she died very young, and I'm going back 100 years, or 1920s, I suppose. Yeah, about 1920s. He used to go and sit in these circles with mediums and one thing or another and table tapping. And he swore that there was no one touching that table. You know, no one was lifting that table, but that table was tapping away like a good one.
Was that in, I don't suppose you know, I was going to ask if it was in darkness or in light.
He used to go, you know, this was the 1920s, and in Glasgow, so I presume it was at night time he would go.
I only ask because you can never, I mean, one thing you can never do be it in a ghost, poltergeist or even medium cases is discount fraud. It does happen, unfortunately, and it's something we always have to consider, I think, before taking a paranormal view. But that's kind of what
he was desperate to contact my grandmother, but he was there one day when there was a policeman came, and he came in disguise. He was trying to catch them out, and he was sitting there and trumpet calling, you know, trumpet rising, you know.
Oh yeah.
And this little girl's voice came out of this trumpet, and this policeman went as white as a sheet. It was his daughter. He swore blind it was his daughter, his little daughter that died.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, my grandfather used to tell us all these stories when we were kids, you know. Whenever we went to Glasgow, we'd sit around with Granddad, tell us a ghost story, tell us this, tell us that. But he used to tell us about his experiences as well. We're trying to contact my grandmother. And those were just two of them. Another time he was trying to contact he was on his way to go and try and contact my grandmother, and he was walking down this dark old road, and he saw something white, and it scared the living daylights out of him. He ran. It turned out it was a horse. put his head over a fence. So these are the sort of things he used to tell us.
Funnily enough, when I was a lot younger than even I am now, I just started paranormal investigating. Just for a kind of personal day, I decided to spend a night in a haunted house in the middle of nowhere, 3 or 4 miles from the nearest road. In the very north of Scotland, in a place called Sandwood Bay. On the grounds that if you're going to ghost hunt, it's the only way to really do it is if you're trapped in the haunted house for the night. Now, not that much happened, but when I first arrived, I had left my torch in charge in the local restaurant. So it was getting dark and I had no light. And then suddenly I started seeing white things floating on the horizon, very much like your contact. And they turned out to be sheep on the hills in the darkness.
Yeah. So it shows you how the mind can play tricks, though, doesn't it? And the mind plays tricks in hauntings as well, you know?
It does indeed. I mean, one of the reasons I don't think we'll ever prove, I'm not saying they don't exist, but we'll never prove apparitional ghosts objectively to other people that haven't experienced them. As, for example, when I was vice chair investigations of the Ghost Club, I organised a investigation into this place called the House of Detention, which was this. It's closed now, but it was a underground prison museum, aka a bit of Chamber of Horrors tucked in as well. And once you dim the lights, it's incredibly. There's also out of bounds areas that really haven't been. Nobody's trodden in for about 100 years. And when you dim the lights, it's a genuinely scary place. And not much was seen, but various members, like possibly nearly all of my investigations team started to report strange sensations, kind of subjective voices in their head. These are the non-psychic ones, telling them that they were imprisoned and they shouldn't be hung and they were innocent. This was a remand prison, by the way, a debtor's prison in effect. So they probably weren't real entities in any way, shape, or form. But it just shows how I think the psychologists call it confirmation bias and things like that, but it really does exist. You put somebody in a really spooky place, and some of the things, not all of the things, but some of the things they pick up will be because you're in a really spooky place, and a little bit of air coming from somewhere or another suddenly feels like a chill in your neck, and so on. So I'm wondering, let's assume there is apparitional phenomena, but I'm wondering how we could ever prove it if there's always this kind of alternative explanation. So, as I kind of said earlier, that's what's brought me from Sandwood Bay and my sheep on the horizon to the House of Detention and my my investigative colleagues basically subjectively freaking out one by one. I'm kind of thinking, if we're ever going to objectively do anything here, it's got to be by these weird objects movements, these pools of water, these spontaneous scratches and so on, because there is no obvious psychological explanation for them.
Have you investigated my distant relative, the Mackenzie poltergeist from Greyfriars Kirkyard?
I haven't, and I don't even have a great I know about it, but I don't have a great working knowledge of the case. Actually, I must admit.
I call him my distant relative because I'm from the Mackenzie clan. I'm a Sept from the Mackenzie clan.
Excellent.
Yeah, and of course, Greyfriars churchyard to us down here, kirkyard to the Scots, was famous for the body snatchers, Burke and Hare.
Yeah.
I mean, but you know, the Mackenzie Poltergeist is in the Black Museum, which is part of the churchyard, or in the churchyard itself. And people have been burned, felt burns on them, got burn marks on them, scratched, knocked unconscious, all sorts of things happen up there. They've now closed it off because so much was happening with this poltergeist there. They've actually closed the Black Museum part off now to the public, and
there you go. That's another case. I mean, I tended to go for about 25 cases through the book. I mean, Gold and Cornell went encyclopedic and took about 500, but I wanted to kind of write it as a sort of narrative of investigation rather than listing them all out. So there are a few missing. My most embarrassing one that's missing, and there's probably the show Shields Poltergeist, which I probably should have included. My apologies, Darren Ritson, because he's a lovely guy and a great investigator. But
you should have done that. That was in 2005, yes?
Oh, yes.
And it doodled, didn't it? It wrote things down.
Yeah, no, it's as I say. Well, as I say, when we go through this, I mean, it doodled the AKA Burley Rectory, which certainly had poltergeist activity, and you've kind of got really common factors, and probably one of the most interesting cases because he kind of jumped genres is Matthew Manning. Matthew Manning, because he started off as 12-year-old boy. We had poltergeist incidents happening in his family home. Father set up a few traps thinking it was the kids, put talcum powder on the floor.
Was this Morley?
Pun? No, this is Matthew Manning. The medium in his family home started off as a poltergeist boy, nearly got expelled from school for more poltergeist activity. Then he started automatic writing, including writings appearing on his walls. Yeah. And then he started to control his powers and gradually became a medium of international repute. So who's to say there's not a very close correlation between poltergeist activity, which could well be uncontrolled mediumistic activity, and mediums who are people with controlled PK energy that have actually just learned to control it, because Matthew Manning went through this full spectrum.
That actually answers my poltergeist here, I believe. Because I'm the same sort of person as Matthew. Right down to the automatic writing. I used to do that as well when I lived in Croydon.
There we go. Case. That's actually fascinating.
Yeah, you're talking about Borley Rectory,
briefly as an example of wall writings, yeah.
Well, there were several things happened there over the year, but I noticed in your book you went to the grave of Harry Price, which is in Pulborough. I was born in Amberley, down the road 5 miles from Pulborough. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, do you know, I didn't know he was there. So the next time I go to visit my grandfather, my British grandfather in Amberley, his grave, I will pop on to Harry Price
It's well worth doing. Apparently, the person that was organising this had to look for about half an hour to find it. It's just kind of under a tree somewhere, and it's I don't know if you saw from the angle of the photograph, but it's traditionally bent at an angle. A fascinating little grave. Harry Price must have been trying to escape once and not quite got out.
but he was one of the first, wasn't he?
Oh, definitely.
One of what I call the first greats.
Yes, Harry Price, our side. I'm trying to remember the famous. What was the name of the famous American one? Just about Carrington. Carrington. What's his name? Second name's Carrington.
Mark, do you know?
No,
I
forgot.
No.
Mark. Oh, well, in that case, somebody will probably be able to fill that in. But yes, it was when it was starting to get slightly scientific in the sense of people trying to collect evidence and witness statements and so on. So absolutely, yes. I mean, Harry Price was a colourful character, but I don't know, plenty of scientists colourful characters that like seeking publicity. Doesn't necessarily mean that he took it one step further, although the jury is probably out on that.
Yeah. And what about ghosts from the Enfield case? Now, I remember I was working for an organisation in London when that case broke in the newspapers, and I used to it was broken in the newspapers, but it was done in sections, a bit like the Amityville Horror when that broke in newspapers. And I'd buy the newspaper one week and then I'd buy it the next week to see what else happened, you know?
Yeah, no, it's some absolutely fascinating case. Difference between Enfield and Amityville is that Enfield, I always like to look at the width of any witness pool in these things, because if enough people see the same thing, the idea of it being a conspiracy of making it up, if you've got 100 people, becomes virtually impossible. Amityville, unfortunately, I think only had the family and possibly one priest who kept changing his mind and whether he saw anything or not.
We interviewed the son, didn't we, Mark?
Yeah, one of the children of the original Amityville horror case.
Amityville, okay. Yeah.
His name is Christopher. He goes, it was the Lutz family because George Lutz married his wife Kathy, but the kids kept their original last name, which is Quarantino. So Christopher Quarantino was the youngest of the children, and he was very, very critical of the original Jay Anson book before the movie, and of course the movies that all came out. He said they were all lies and crap. But he maintained that what happened there was actually much more frightening than what anybody's ever been told. But he keeps it quiet because if he speaks about it publicly, he's afraid that these Hollywood producers and pinheads will steal the story because he mentioned it in public and make more movies. And, they're all making money off of what happened to his family, and the family never saw a dime. Because his parents sold the rights way back when, and they had no idea what was going to happen. And so he's very bitter about that. Plus, he's very bitter about his his stepfather. Because they think he's the one who brought a lot of that into the house because he was practicing...
black magic?
He was into martial arts big time, and they think he was doing some occult stuff.
Wasn't he also drunk?
Well, hang on. No, I actually started discussing Amityville. I mean, my experience of the Amityville Horror was to get about three different versions of what happened, skeptical and non-skeptical. Obviously, I haven't been over there, but nevertheless, what I actually found is very few people actually disagreed about what was supposed to have happened, and if you actually look at what happened, I don't think it was a straightforward fake, even though I started putting in a chapter about potential fakes, because a lot of the stuff that happened is so mundane. They thought they saw the image of Satan in the back of their fireplace in suit. I mean, that's about akin to seeing the image of Jesus in a slice of toast. It all happened. I mean, you think about it.
That slice of toast sold for a fortune. Did you know?
Yeah, no, it's all just pareidolia. I mean, if you're going to make up, if you were going to be totally fictitious, and let's forget films, but obviously you're going to do something a bit better than that. Footprint in the snow, about the size of a devil's footprint. Ask any track expert. A squirrel's paw print in melting snow can become the size of a bear. I mean, who's to say what the size of the devil's footprint is? I think this family were, for whatever reason, now we looked for triggers, didn't we, earlier? You not only had a house move there, you had a house move into a house of a mass murderer. Yeah. Not only did you have a house move into the house of a mass murderer, but they overextended themselves on the mortgage. They wanted a house for $50,000. They ended up, because it was such a bargain, spending $80,000 on a house they couldn't really afford. So there you've got George Lutz, who may or may not be dabbling, but he's overextending in his mortgage. He's in the house of a mass murderer. He wakes up at 3 o'clock every morning, which shows he's short of sleep. He's perceiving that's the time the murders were taking place, which is probably roughly correct, but one probably causes the other to wake up. He has smells of flies and excrement. I'm nearly tempted to say,
I've never smelt a fly's poo.
Yeah. I mean, it's. I'm nearly tempted to say, bring in the plumbers, and I don't necessarily mean TAPS. But I mean, all these things. If you were actually inventing a ghost story poltergeist, it's all really silly stuff. So I actually tend to think that most of it probably happened, and what you're kind of left with is a few potentially interesting poltergeist events, moving of a heavy object, and I think it was a China lion, possible levitation of Kathy Lutz, and I'm sure your former guest told of stuff, as he said, the really scary stuff that isn't in the book. So I think take away all the fourth, and you've probably got a good little poltergeist case there. The trouble is, as they were only there 28 days, and they didn't really invite anyone else round to experience it, the witness pool's so narrow, you can only really take, well, at the moment, the surviving children's words for it, and even you can not disbelieve them, but there's no way you can make the jump from saying that one witness proves a case, which is why Enfield on provability is so much better than Amityville, but it doesn't mean the other one's false.
No,
well, just keep in mind also, Amityville was also made famous by Ed and Lorraine Warren. And,
oh, yes.
And
what did they do to Enfield?
Yeah, well, not much.
Tried
and they
to get in on that, went back and told everybody it was their case, or they were working on it.
Yeah.
They didn't have crosses turning upside down by the end of I haven't seen The Conjuring 2, actually, but I hear it's a very good horror movie, but not necessarily strictly on the facts. Facts of
it's fictional, just like what they did with the first Conjuring movie. Most of it, what happened, is fictional, and the Warrens themselves, I feel they were charlatans. I don't believe.
Some of the say that because we're friends with Johnny Depp.
John Zaffis is a nice guy. He's
John Zaffis is the nephew
of Ed Warren. But you know what? They were publicity seekers. Lorraine may have been a gifted psychic, but her husband, they were demonologists. So of course everything had to be a demon. Yes. and I don't have a lot of respect for them. But they inserted themselves into the Amityville horror case and made it even more of a circus show. And
same way as they tried to insert themselves into the Enfield case. They were over here at a time at a talk or something in London. They heard about the Enfield case and they turned up there at the house. Politely told to bug off, I believe.
I think according to Guy Playfair, they spent, I think he invited them in for a couple of hours and spoke to them, but that was probably the extent of their involvement. And I must admit, I do have a certain amount of tolerance to investigators that don't mind a little bit of publicity. I do have a soft spot for Harry Price, but to actually say that it was their major case when they spent, from what I could gather, an afternoon there is just one step too far, in my opinion.
Well, this is it. Yeah, but
there is a line that I talk about in chapter 9 that can't be crossed if you're going to stay, if you're going to stay in the right side of objectivity, and I'll let other people decide whether that line was crossed or not.
They went back to America and told everyone that they've been working on the case, the Enfield case. But all these films anyway, they're overhyped, aren't they? That's how you get the bums on the seat. Let's face it. You've got to put in the thrill factor.
Well, you know what? Even other films based on real cases, like, one of my favorites from the early '80s was The Entity with Barbara Hershey. Now, that was based on a real case that Barry Taff and Carrie Gaynor from UCLA worked on, but again, most of that film was fictionalized. For dramatic effect for movies. Very few. Actually, one of my favorite haunted house movies, which was totally fictional, but you know what? They got it 90% correct, was The Changeling with George C. Scott. Came out in like 1979 or 1980. Perfect.
I used to love that film.
Perfect haunted house film. And the seance scene was creepy, but the fact that what impressed me the most is that they used EVP in that film before even EVP was even really known in the paranormal community, when he had his reel-to-reel recorder and got the voices on the tape. Other than the overly dramatic ending, it was perfect as a haunted house movie in how they portrayed everything. But again, still, movies are movies, and they're made to get butts in seats and fear sells, and so do the television shows. And, speaking as someone who has appeared on a couple of the television shows, let me tell you, most of them are crap. And the producers make things up. They fake things on purpose in order to make things more scary, and they misrepresent evidence. Because if it's not scary, true paranormal research is, as I like to say, boring as whale shit. And
a lot of sitting around, yeah.
And
it's a bit like fishing.
Nine times out of 10, nothing happens. So when these shows go in every single week and they find all this activity going on, it's like, you can't believe it.
I wish somebody on TV would actually think that there might be a different way of doing the paranormal, kind of have more a journalistic show on what's going on, because there's a lot of interesting stuff going on, rather than, I don't know if Most Haunted invented it and America copied it, or whether Most Haunted copied something in America. But ever since then, there's just been one genre. 4 or 5 people in haunted house with bit of equipment, one of which is psychic. And I mean, it's come on, get a bit of imagination, guys. It's a really exciting topic. There's more than one way of playing it, because you're right. You're eventually, by season 3, you either give up or you're forced to kind of drag an unknown person up an unknown staircase in Pontefract, because I haven't seen the episode, so I couldn't possibly comment on it. But there's got to be. I mean, they forced themselves down this avenue by just concentrating on this one particular one-dimensional part of the subject. There's all kinds of fascinating things they could explore. I mean, they could talk to real-life investigators. They could have interesting debates between us and skeptics. They can film strange places in Romania and talk about how there's a similarity between what's happening there and Poltergeist in England.
Yeah.
That's a good idea. Any TV companies out there? Give me a ring.
We'll do it with you. We'll do it with you, John. Right, I'll tell you one of the cases that I liked. I don't know whether you've heard of Pete the Polt, have you?
No, I'm not doing very well with your cases.
No, it came from Cardiff. Oh, it wasn't one of my cases, but it was a famous poltergeist case in Cardiff. Pete the Polt. It was a family-run garage, and things started happening. Stones started being thrown at the roof and things like that, which you'd think obviously was kids. But money started going missing, and then they find the money shredded. Now, this is shredded up and stuck on the ceiling.
I think I vaguely have heard of this one now. Yeah. But it's fascinating the way it always seems to start with stones. I mean, as I say, that was a traditional thing of the Duande in Colombia, and I doubt they were in contact with anyone in Wales. And I doubt that anyone in Wales was in contact with anyone in Colombia. So quite how, if you were making these things up, you kind of start with the old stones and or pools of water and or missing things from the dishwasher never to return. Yeah. It just makes you think there has to be something in it.
Well, there has to be. There really has to be. You know, I know what goes on in this house of mine. Okay, I've not had any pools of water unless Gertie's done a pee on the floor. But I've had bangs. I've had doors opening and shutting. I've had footsteps on the stairs. Now that's been not heard not only by me but by my husband, by my mother when she was alive, and several of the guests that have stayed at the house have heard the footsteps coming up the stairs early hours of the morning, and all sorts of weird things. You know.
Does it happen? Did you say you practiced automatic writing?
I used to be, I went through the whole lot from mediumship to transmediumship. I've done automatic writing. I've done investigations. I've done readings for people that I've stopped because I found out I never charged, and I ended up being a party piece for people's dinners, entertainment and things like that. So I stopped doing that. I've done. I'm a remote viewer. I've done so many things. So many things happen to me, you know, from time slips to all sorts of weird stuff, don't they, Mark? And we have very, very deep conversations, me and Mark, on it. Very deep conversations on all these things. You know, things that will blow your mind, these conversations that we have.
No, I think I'm doing this from memory. I think Matthew Manning, I mean, he's written a whole book about it, so check it out yourself. But I think Matthew Manning actually found that when he started to do the controlled stuff, the spontaneous stuff started to go away because he was channeling it elsewhere, and if he stopped doing the controlled stuff, the spontaneous stuff would slightly come back.
Maybe that
it could be. It nearly sounds like you are not opposite, because you're not doing so much these days, from what you said, and you're getting the odd bit of spontaneous stuff.
Could be my energy spiking for all I know, you know. Yeah.
Interesting. It's just a passing thought, but I'd say there's a potential energy source if you've been able to do all those things in the past. But
it was like I went from one thing to another. I went in stages and progressed. And it was like a learning curve to get to where I am now in my knowledge of it all. That's the way I look at it. I'm totally retired now. I don't do anything except talk on the radio about the subjects now. Is that right, Mark? He's very quiet. Very quiet.
I'm just listening to you guys talk.
Yeah, but it's like I said, Mark and I have such deep conversations, and we used to have such deep conversations on all this. Didn't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Fascinating subject.
Yeah, because we've looked at different aspects of things, talking to a lot of people, looking at different theories, getting away from the traditional theories, which don't really, hold water very well when you really put them into scrutiny. People just keep repeating things that they've heard from ghost shows or things that have been repeated since the spiritualism
what they've
age.
Read on the internet.
Yeah, in Victorian times. And this is why we know that there's a lot more going on than what we really think. I mean, it definitely is worthy of investigating to find out different theories on reality, what's really happening.
We like to step back and look at things from different sides, different aspects of it all, and really chew the fat over it, sort of thing.
I know, and there's been a lot of books about a haunted house or a poltergeist case, but there's not been that many trying to mull over what it all might be about. So I kind of hope I found a gap in the market, even if it's to read and say no and write a critique about why I might be wrong in certain aspects, because that's how we kind of make things progress. So
you have definitely found a gap in it. It's right what you're saying. There hasn't been a lot written on it. Everyone talks about it. We talked about it many times on the show, Poltergeist. Well, we've been talking about other things, but, the Poltergeist bit would come into it and one thing or another. But really, there is not a lot of literature on it.
No, I was shocked. I mean, I mentioned Colin Wilson's book. There was one after that. There was John and Ann Spencer did one on Poltergeist in the mid-90s, but even that is 25 years ago.
But it is actually, to me, it's all about getting to the nitty-gritty of it. Why does this happen?
Only the reader.
What causes it?
Only the reader, I suppose, can decide if I do get to the nitty-gritty with Poltergeist and your investigation.
Yeah. I've got a habit of, when I really get deep into a particular phenomena, thinking about a particular phenomena, I've got a habit of feeling it inside me, feeling that actual... and getting answers. I do end up getting some sort of answers, but you have to. It's very similar to when you're doing mediumship. You have to feel it inside you. You have to be sense everything. You use every sense that you've got, like in remote viewing, you know? It is just also, it's crazy. Let's face it, it is crazy. But I hope one day someone comes up with the answer, what is a poltergeist and why does this happen? But there are so many, theories out there, like from what Mark said, adolescent children to people's energy peaking, to traumas, to everything. It all seems to be involved. Hauntings. Well, it just all seems to be tied in.
Well,
especially hauntings.
There's a case I haven't really talked about much before. That's right here near me, where there was a family. We investigated their house a few times, and there was some interesting poltergeist activity that happened right in the middle of us while we were investigating. We were standing in the kitchen. There was about 3 of us investigating and the couple who owned the house. And while we're sitting there having a conversation, a quarter drops right in the middle of the floor in front of us. And
that's another thing, money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now there was some change on the counter behind the one client, and I kept wanting to think that maybe he did it. When we weren't looking, he just flipped the quarter out. But then it happened again a few minutes later. We're walking out of the kitchen. He's going in one direction with the other investigators. I'm walking with his wife. And all of a sudden, another quarter flies over her and drops right down in front of me on the kitchen floor.
And there's nobody within reach of them on the second occasion, for sure.
Yeah. It's one of those things. I just can't sit there and say, yes, this is paranormal. Quarters falling. You always want to suspect somebody is maybe messing with you, but it happened. And then a third time, we were shooting, a television show had come in. I'm embarrassed to say Americans will know who I'm talking about. The Maury Povich show. Oh, what a...
The what show, sorry?
Maury Povich show, which is real bad tabloid TV. Usually he focuses on who's the baby daddy, whether or not, you are the father. But occasionally he would do a paranormal show. And they did one on the house, and while we were all upstairs filming, and we heard something hit the ground, and we went downstairs and we looked all around. We found the quarter on the floor. So
it's just so repeatable and so common. Whether it's a stone or a quarter, or somebody contacted me recently in a case that we didn't really get a chance to follow up, partly due to lockdown. It was batteries just appearing from nowhere and being flung. And it's so, if you were going to make something up, I think you'd come up with something a bit more horror film spectacular than just the quarters, the stones. But it's so consistent. It's
And have you noticed these things never hit you? They come at you, they come close sometimes, but they never hit you.
Yes, the first thing I always say to somebody who's got a possible poltergeist incident is don't worry, they never do you any harm. And I conveniently forget about the entity case because I don't have a huge working knowledge of it. I had actually heard of it before you guys mentioned it, but I suspect there was more to it than being killed by a poltergeist, because that never happens, does it?
I've never known it. The entity case, that's the one where he was...
There was a death in the end, if I remember.
In which case are we talking about?
In the entity.
No.
There was a death in the end.
No, there was no death. The woman in the entity case, it was a woman who was being attacked and raped by an incubus, and the activity just continued in real life for a number of years until it slowly subsided and went away. But nobody.
This is the one where he was looking in the attic. And he was on the steps.
Yeah, there was the San Pedro case with the woman named Jackie. It was the same team, and one of the cameramen. This was a fascinating case. If you could find the original documentary on it, with the footage that they shot, was scary as hell, because they went up in the attic because they heard a noise, and as they were coming out of the attic, the first guy heard the other guy make a sound, and he turned around. It's pitch black, he couldn't see, so he snapped a flash picture, and there in the flash picture, there's the guy with a clothesline tied around his neck, and the clothesline is up over a nail, and he's hanging to death. So they had to rush over and grab him, and they actually had to lift him up to get the clothesline off the nail. If the guy hadn't turned around, he would have been dead. And then they kept having, the walls were bleeding some kind of material, and this thing followed the investigators home back to their apartment. The stove kept turning on by itself, and then they hear crashing, and then they go back into the kitchen. There'd be a knife embedded in the floor, and then something else would happen, take them out of the kitchen, and then when they came back in the kitchen, sitting on the gas stove, it turned off, but there was a box of bullets that, if the flame would have been turned on, could have spelled disaster. So it was a really intense case.
This strikes me as so atypical. I'd like to look more closely on it, in the sense that once you get bleeding walls, you've got so much an element of, well, dare I say, Hollywood, that all I'll say is that case is so outside the normal zone of poltergeist activity. I'd love to. Are any of the witnesses still alive?
Well, Barry Taff worked on that, and as well as parapsychologist Carrie Gaynor. They're still alive. The woman, Jackie, I forget her last name. I don't know if she should still be alive. She'd be in her 60s by now. And her children at the time. I'm trying to... I'm going to try to find the documentary. Here we go.
Actually, do email it to me later if you don't mind, because that sounds.
I'm gonna put it. I'm gonna put it here in Skype, and you could look it up on YouTube, because it's called "The World's Scariest Ghost Caught on Tape." The San Pedro Haunting. And
I can do that. Yeah.
It's a 45-minute documentary, and it was what they showed. What happened to these guys was really bad. At one point, she even moved out of the house, moved up to Northern California, and the house that they were living in had activity follow them up there. And while they were sitting around a table, I think they were trying to do a seance, the same guy who got hung, whatever this thing was, did not like him, literally picked him up and threw him backwards up against the wall away from the table.
So he got hung, just about got his life saved, and still was quite happy to liaise with the entity.
Yes.
Okay. Brave man.
Oh, here we go. Jackie Hernandez. That was her name. Here, I'm gonna send this other link.
He's put the link there on Skype for you. You just have to click the link.
Yeah, I'll have a look at that in due course. Actually,
yeah. There's I found another one too. It's another documentary. We might have a lot of the same footage, but. There was a
sorry about this, listeners. They're just passing things to each other here.
Well,
for listeners,
will be
fascinated about a case like that. To be honest, I am.
Yeah, for any of our listeners, if you go out to YouTube and type in the San Pedro haunting or Jackie Hernandez, a couple of these documentaries come up that show all of the footage, and it is very, very intense footage.
Yes, it is good footage. They're very good documentaries, actually.
Well, you know what?
Right, so
we are actually coming up on the end of the show here, John. So
we've done 2 hours. That's gone quick.
Yes, it went very, very quick.
We've also provided a listener with excellent links to look at just before bed. In the most apparently evilest poltergeist I've ever heard of. A lot of them in my book are far more mundane compared with that. And I will still, on a serious note, I will still say that 99.9% of poltergeist phenomena was very disconcerting and scary, obviously, because it's something that just happens and is totally unknown, is highly unlikely to do you any harm other than the fear factor itself.
Yeah.
So my advice to anyone that does have any poltergeist phenomena is just go with it, because it might even be part of you.
Well, let's plug your book. So your book is Poltergeist, a new investigation into destructive hauntings. And where can people get a hold of your book?
People can get hold of it in Amazon UK, Amazon USA, Mighty Ape, if you happen to be in New Zealand or Australia and just listening in, Thrift Books, and just about everywhere. It's actually out on the 1st of August, but is available for pre-order now. And if anyone wishes to contact me about anything, shall I give my Twitter profile?
Sure.
If I can remember it. Yes, it's at Ghost Fraser. That's GHOST, obviously. Fraser in the good old Scottish way, FRASER, as opposed to the American TV series.
No Z.
No Z. Or no I or anything like that. Just FRASER.
Okay.
But yes, all I would say is it's has been a neglected subject, and it might be a good way of getting people back up to speed, as a lot has been happening over the last 30 years that hasn't necessarily gone into book form.
Yeah.
Well, John, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show tonight. This really has been a fascinating discussion, and really had a great time. We hope you enjoyed it as well.
Don't go away, John. Don't go away.
No, I wouldn't. It's been a totally spontaneous pleasure.
Okay. All right. And,
don't go away, and we'll tell you how it all works.
So, we'll want to thank everyone for tuning in for another episode of the Paranormal UK radio show here on the Paranormal UK radio network. You could catch our archived podcasts on Podbean, Stitcher, and iTunes, and then you can also hear us streaming on our own radio server at paukradio.com. And where else can people find us?
Just about everywhere, people. Just Google and you'll find us.
Yes. All right. Well, thanks a lot, everyone. And as usual, stay safe, and we will catch you next week. Have a great one.
Okay, bye.